Okay, chapter 12, part 3. Before we continue on with our theories of market discrimination, starting with employers, then customers, etc., I want to point you to the application that's on page 448 of the book. And this is one about selecting musicians in symphony orchestras. And this is based on a famous article that was published in 2000, in the year 2000, involving the evolution of the way that people would audition for orchestras. It used to be that it was that you had the people who were judging were watching the people perform and making their determinations to who made the cut and who did not. And then they switched to doing blind auditions. It's sort of like on the show The Voice, where the chair turns after you push a button and decide you like that person, even though you all you have done is hear the person. You are not choosing them on the basis of who they are and what they look like. And it shows, as you would kind of suspect, that people who, during the blind auditions, a greater percentage of women got chosen than when they had the regular auditions. I only point that out because actually last fall there was an article in the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal about this very thing, and they found that when you study it a little later, it didn't seem to be as much due to discrimination as you thought. So what the article ends up pointing out is it's a very complicated issue as to why sometimes there are differences in representation among different groups. So what is talked about in example 12.1 is no longer accepted as being the end-all and be-all for trying to show that there was discrimination, and there's a big reduction in discrimination amongst classical musicians. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, so let's get to talking about discrimination models and see what insights we can gain from that. Okay. So let's start with employer discrimination, which would be the one that would be most obvious to you. And this is a situation where the employer is making their choice on the basis of a characteristic other than marginal productivity. And let's say they're discriminating against women, although we could say women and minorities and throw them into the same group, or people of a certain religious background or sexual preference, whatever it is. We have the non-discriminated group, men, and the discriminated group that we're calling women here, but can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Okay, so they will not refuse to hire them, but they will treat them as if they are less productive, okay? And there will be some price at which they will be willing to hire the discriminated group, but it's going to be a price that's less than what is being paid for the non-discriminated group. Because if you think about it, I mean, what is discrimination all about? There are people who work at a company and claim discrimination. Well, they obviously got hired by the company. So what are they complaining? They're complaining that they didn't get paid as much as people with different non-productive characteristics, or they didn't have the same promotional opportunities, whatever the circumstances might be. And there's lots of examples that you can find where that comes into play. So this is the way that we would sort of develop the model. So the marginal revenue product of men is equal to WM, okay? But females are being discriminated against, so their marginal revenue product is not given the same weight as men, and so there's going to be some devaluation, which we're going to call D, okay? So when we rearrange that, we get the marginal revenue product is going to be equal to the wage that women get plus the amount by which they are discriminated against. And in equilibrium, where we're going to have both of these marginal revenue products equal to each other, what we find is the wage for females is going to be equal to the wage for males minus the devaluation factor. So for example, let's say men are getting paid 25 an hour and women 22 an hour. 22 equals 25 minus D is going to be equal to 3. So women are being devalued to that degree, okay? So if you want to be able to compete, you've got to be willing to work for less, okay? So the issue related to that can be shown on the diagram here. And that is, we've got the marginal revenue product, which does not distinguish between men and women, because we're assuming there is no difference based on gender in terms of that. The women are going to get a wage equal to WF, and the men are going to get a wage equal to WF plus D. Simply take D and add it to both sides, and that's how you get the relationship here. So men are getting paid, in our example I just gave you, women 22, men 22 plus the $3 devaluation factor applied to women, they're going to get $25 an hour. And so the level of employment for men is going to be at N0, for women it's going to be at N1. But if you look at those, if you're discriminating, look at this. The productivity of hiring women here is going to be, and by labor here, we're looking at women and minorities. It would be in the economic interest to hire women who are cheaper, and there's this whole distance here between N0 and N1 where their marginal revenue product is below that for what men are getting paid, but higher than their wage. So the discrimination that comes into play is going to be here if firms choose not to hire women and hire men instead. In other words, pretty simple. There's an economic incentive for equally productive workers, if you don't discriminate, to hire whoever's cheaper. But if you do discriminate, you're discriminating to the point where the market difference is going to be the $3, because that's the amount of the discrimination factor that we're talking about. Okay. So what is the implication of this? The implication of this should be rather obvious. Those who discriminate are going to earn lower profits. In a competitive market, they will incur losses. So therefore, the decision to discriminate is not driven by a profit incentive. It's not driven by a goal of maximizing profits. It's driven by a goal of maximizing utility, okay? So to shareholders, discriminating will cause a reduction in profits and a reduction in the dividends or stock price, but some tangible way will reduce the value associated with the company. Now, why does discrimination take place? Well, to a supervisor, the impact of their discriminating may be pretty imperceptible in terms of their compensation, and so they work to act out their discriminatory tendencies, and it, whatever perverse way, adds to their utility, and the overall impact is just a drop in the bucket with respect to the entire company. And even if it is company-wide, then if you bring another company in that makes an effort to not discriminate, that would give them a competitive advantage with regards to those firms that do. So a lot of economists look at the profit motive as a basis to say that discrimination coming from the employer, there's got to be more to it. Either you've got like an agency issue with regards to people who are not owners who can act based upon their twisted preferences, or something else has to be at play. We're going to get to that something else in just a bit. Okay, so what we showed you was for an individual firm, the discriminating employer, just to recap, will stop at N0. The non-discriminating employer will stop at N1. Okay. What is the market outcome? Well, the market outcome, we're going to show it in kind of a weird way. We're going to look at, on the horizontal axis, we're going to look at the employment of women and minorities. On the vertical axis, we're going to look at the ratio of what women earn to what men earn, okay? So we start with the following diagram here, and where we haven't brought in the supply of labor, but we've brought in the demand for labor. We have this horizontal portion here. The horizontal portion takes into account those employers who are non-discriminating, because to them, it's like the blind audition. I don't care what your gender happens to be. I only care about your productivity, so they would pay men and women exactly the same. To the extent there are employers that are discriminating, of course, this is going to be on the portion of the demand curve below a ratio of 1 because women are getting paid less than men. In our example with $22 and $25 an hour between the wages of women and men, that would be a ratio equal to 0.88. So it would probably be somewhere around here. So the ones who discriminate will be below 1 on the demand curve. The ones who do not discriminate will be exactly at 1. Okay, so what we need to do is then draw the supply curve of labor and figure out where the market wage is. Okay. Or the rate, and in this case, it's going to be the ratio between men and women. So let's say the supply of labor for women and minorities. Okay, so let's mark that. Women and minorities would be here. It's intersecting the demand curve on the downward sloping portion. And lo and behold, the market outcome is going to show that, that women are going to get paid less than men. All right. Are there any sort of conclusions that we can draw from this? Well, one conclusion that we can draw from this is if discriminatory attitudes remain, but they diminish over time, the horizontal portion of this is going to get greater, and then the downward sloping part is going to shift further to the right, and there'll still be some discrimination, but there's going to be less than before. So let me just draw that as one final part of the diagram. If now we're at D prime, where there's an increase in the number of firms who say, hey, this is wrong, but still some who discriminate, the ratio of women's wages to men will start to increase. Okay. The implication of this should be rather obvious. It's a strong incentive not to discriminate. Over time, as people have attitudes that are more inclined not to discriminate, then the market outcome is going to improve. And this is without any laws or anything else. It's just a change in attitude. All right. We'll continue our discussion on different theories of discrimination in part 4.